Most High put together. We gon' see. In times.
Serpents lurking, watchers watching, y'all sure I'll stay on point. They lurking. We under the covenant, we ain't got no other choice. Gird your loins up, armor up, cause it's time for war. We the generation that's gon' get on one accord. Serpents lurking, watchers watching, y'all sure I'll stay on point.
Got real
We
now.
under the covenant, we ain't got no other choice. Gird your loins up, armor up, cause it's time for war.
Alright, so now that we were able to recant Israelite migrations into West Africa by way of the 9th century Jewish traveler Eldad, we shall continue to establish the history of migrations after certain captivities and events.
Explain the importance of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD and the group that went south and why.
Sure.
Where the judgment was that led to that according to your beliefs.
Okay. Well, by the time of the Roman occupation, you had already gone through. We had already gone through numerous captivities, and so when you look at the Roman occupation, that was simply a very violent and physical destruction. And when that occurred, the destruction of the temple, the smashing of the Hebraic idea, the hiding of the scrolls down at Qumran, etc., we went into exile. Now, logically, if you have a military power, an oppressive military power coming from the north, it wouldn't make good common sense to flee to the north. So our position is that many, if not most, of the Israelites that remain, and particularly Judah, went south. We migrated down both banks of the Red Sea. We migrated down the Nile River. We migrated across North Africa and then down into the southern areas, into what is now called the Western Coast. And so when you look in Ghana, for example, you will find that the Ashanti, the Ewe, the Yoruba, and Igbo in Nigeria, present-day Nigeria, all of these different ethnic groups have Hebrewisms, what one scholar called Hebrewisms, cultural similarities to the ancient biblical Israelites. Circumcision on the 8th day, linguistic connections, name similarities, separation of the women during menstrual cycle and after childbirth, etc., etc. Well,
various pieces of information indicating very early immigrants to Africa from the Semitic world do exist. During the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them. According to Jewish authors, some Hebrews or Israelites tried to escape their wrath by fleeing into Africa. Speaking of the Jews, Lichbald says, press on the regional conflicts, Jews settled as warriors and traders in Yemen, the Horn of Africa, Egypt, the Kingdom of Cush and Nubia, North African Punic settlements, and areas now covered by Mauritania. More immigrants followed these early Jewish settlers to Africa following the Assyrian conquest of the Israelites in the 8th century BCE. Rabbi Dalton Nasi has placed the Hebrew Israelites all over the African continent. Now, to establish for a fact that Israelite migrations were taking place as early as the 7th or 8th century BCE, we will deal with one of the first stopping points within Africa, the places where Jeremiah and Hosea warned Israel not to go. This place is known as Elephantine or Aswan, Egypt. According to the Black Jews of Africa by Edith Brewer, historians usually date the settling of Jewish soldiers in the region of Elephantine back to the middle of the 7th century BCE, specifically at the time when Manasseh was free from his Assyrian overlord and was able to provide mercenaries to Egypt in order to obtain their support. Now this gets very, very interesting because we actually see a time within scripture where Hosea is speaking of the northern kingdom or the house of Ephraim fleeing the land of Israel to make their way into Egypt. Verses 10 through 16 of Hosea 7 reads, "And the pride of Israel testified to his face, and that they do not return to the Lord their God, nor seek him for all this. Ephraim also is like a silly dove without heart. They call to Egypt, and they go to Assyria. When they shall go, I will spread my net upon them. I will bring them down as the fowls of the heavens. I will chastise them as their congregation have heard. Woe unto them, for they have fled from me. Destruction unto them, because they have transgressed against me. Though I have redeemed them, yet they have spoken lies against me. And they have not cried unto me with their hearts. When they howled upon their beds, they assembled themselves for corn and wine, and they rebelled against me. Though I have bound and strengthened their arms, yet do they imagine mischief against me. They return, but not to the Most High. They are like deceitful bow. Their princes shall fall by the sword for the range of their tongue. This shall be their derision in the land of Egypt. Now that's very interesting, because the book The Jews of Africa tells us that Sargon, or Sennacherib, the successor of Shalmaneser III, king of Assyria, having continued the war commenced by his predecessors, conquered the kingdom of Israel and brought the captive Jews and their king Hoshea to his country around 722 BCE, and from thence they eventually found their way into Abyssinia and Ethiopia. Again, this is just showing that indeed during the time of the Assyrian exile, Israelites were seeking refuge in Africa. But for now, let's deal with the origin of the Jewish colony of Senin, Aswan. Now, when looking at this Aramaic papyri found in Aswan, the occurrence of persons named Hoshea is especially frequented. Throughout various subscribed papyrus, Israelites bear the name of Hoshea. For example, we find names such as Hosea, son of Petinun, Hosea, son of Peliah, and also Hosea, son of Riah, which were found throughout these papyrus in Aswan. So with this frequency of the name Hosea, it may be a clue to the origin of the Jewish colony in Upper Egypt. In the Bible, the name Hosea is almost exclusively applied to Ephraimites. The oldest bearer of the name is Hosea, son of Nun, of the tribe of Ephraim. Now this solitary exception does not hinder us from concluding that the name Hoshea was especially common in the northern kingdom, and particularly in the tribe of Ephraim, as then this name appears in the colony of Senin and Elephantine as one of the commonest personal names. It seems reasonable to suggest that this colony, at least part, consisted of descendants of people belonging to the 10 tribes. It goes on to say that the suggestion derived from these two names, such as Hosea and Menahem, which is also found in the papyri as well, may serve to throw a clear light on the Jewish colonists at Senin. They were in part at least descendants of the 10 tribes who with their Persian army under Cambyses had come from their second home in Assyria and Media to Egypt, where they received grants of land. So as we can see, Israelites indeed made their way into Africa, especially into Aswan and Senin. Now moving on, we can see that tribes actually left Senin or Aswan for West Africa. Two of those tribes, to name a few, are the Akan and the Soninke. We can go to the African Fact Book to look at some of this history. The traditions of the Soninke, founders of the Ghana Empire, from whose ashes rose the Mali and Songhai empires at different times, asserts that their remote founding ancestor was born in the region of Sona or Aswan in Upper Egypt. Now Boubacar Lam actually situates the departure of the Soninke ancestors from Egypt no later than 486 BC as a result of the extractions of the Persian king Darius on the inhabitants of the Nile Valley. The foundations of the society and state that would later become the Empire of Ghana will have occurred no later than 460 BC. Now this is important because when we was reviewing the history of Eldad the Danite and how those tribes that he was talking about made their way from Egypt into Ethiopia into West Africa, he actually mentioned that he was traveling throughout Africa with a Soninke Jew of the desert. But continuing on, the Khans are said to be blood relatives of the Soninke of the old Ghana Empire, who are now spread over modern-day Senegal, Gambia, Mali, Mauritania, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Burkina Faso, and Guinea-Bissau. According to Boubacar Lam, the earliest kingdoms of the Western Sudan from about 460 BC were Neo-Pharaonic kingdoms and will remain so until the beginning of the Islamization on the region with Almoravid conquest around 1076 AD. Now this actually mirrors the traditions of Eldad, who spoke about the Jewish kingdoms in West Africa coming to an end as a result of the invading Muslims around 1076 AD. So now let's focus on the migrations of the so-called lost tribes of Israel into the Sahara. And to do that, we're going to look at the book New System of Astronomy. Within this book, it mentions off something very interesting and detailed. It starts off by saying Harmattan is the name for the disorder which affects the interior of Africa. This name is a compound word from the Hebrew word har, which is mount, and matan, which is give, probably because this air is brought from the direction of Mount Sinai, where the law was given. The probability of this surmise will be strengthened by Mungo's Park's account in his travels, where this disorder prevails. He describes it to come over the great desert of the Sahara with a northeast wind. By his narrative, it also appears that the Negro inhabitants of this interior are not Aborigines.
Watch what is happening in this country. Many people here now don't know where they come from and where they belong. Everybody just, as we are seeing ourselves, we call ourselves, we are the same. We are not the same.
We are not the same?
Yeah, we are not the same.
Well, why do you think so?
If you look at you, you know that I'm not from Nigeria. I'm an Israel, and I'm a Biafran.
You're from Israel?
Yeah.
I didn't know.
And what appears very presumptive is that they are descendants of some of the dispersed 10 tribes of Israel. If so, the name Harmattan is easily accounted for. Continuing on to West African countries and peoples, it mentions a migration of the 10 tribes into the Sahara as well. And it says, the 10 tribes of Israel, after they were left to follow the dictates of their own mind, and during the commotion and destructive warfare which ensued to escape utter extermination, migrated according to the usage of times in vast numbers into various countries, but principally into northern Africa, as it then presented the safest and easiest route. Once settled, every commotion and intestine war had the most powerful effect on inducing these bands to shift their abode still further, and so lose all connection with the other branch of the tribe. As hundreds of years pass on and generation after generation roll away, they lose a great many of their habits and customs, becoming more amalgamated with the population with which they associate. But when Mohammedanism overspread northern Africa, destroying by fire and sword all those of another religion, the Israelitish descendants, or the inhabitants occupying the central portion of Africa, passed forward, seeking shelter to the south and west, and part, namely those from the east central, crossing the Benue or Jalaba branch of the Niger, descending gradually southward and becoming intermingled with the original inhabitants, protected from incursion on the north by the Benue River, and quietly settled between the Great Niger and Old Calabar rivers. They remained in peace and grew from one generation to another in idolatry, but still leaving tangible proofs in the form of their religion of the Judaistic origin of the inhabitants.
This is a symbolic chicken. It's made of steel and copper for cleansing offer, to make it holy. I don't know where any of the priests might have gone to, and his offer is polluted. So we want to make sure that all of us came here with pure and clean offer. And of course, this is a palm frond, I'm sure you have palm fronds in Israel. So he's now going to start from his own. He says he's making the offer holy. If anybody touched this offer while the person is defiled, not pure, whether male or female, may the offer be cleansed for purposes of this gathering. This thing must have happened so many years ago, but the wandering Hebrews in the forests before they came here still remember to call on the God of Abraham when they want to break kola nut and talk to God. And they don't call him Abraham, they say Chukwu Abiama. Chukwu means God. Abiama is a corruption of Abraham. Chukwu Abiama. This is called Ebo, to keep out evil persons and evil spirits. 12 days to the feast, all married women from the particular compound will come and prepare food for their ancestors.
So when it comes to Israelites migrating into Africa, that can be applied to the southern kingdom of Judah as well. And to look at that history, we can go back to the origin of the Jewish colony of Sinim. Within Sinim, the northern kingdom constituted a common colony together with Judeans, who had probably come to Egypt either directly from Judea or from Babylonia with the Persian army. The mixed character of the colony would explain the surprising circumstances that this member are sometimes designated Jews or Judeans and sometimes Arameans, as Jews would be designated only those members of the colony who came from the province of Judah or who were descendants of Judeans coming from Babylon. On the other hand, descendants of the 10 tribes will be called Arameans. At all events, we may assume that the descendants of the 10 tribes were not yet called Judeans in the time of the first Persian kings, when the Ephraimites found themselves in Aswan side by side with Judeans and united in one community. So even after the time of the Babylonian exile, you had Judeans find their way into this community where the northern tribes were already settled. So the Assyrians were not the only kings to come up against Israel. 200 years later, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the first temple. Again, the Israelites tried to escape persecution and ran into the continent of Africa, even after they were instructed by Jeremiah not to. And we can take a look at some of those instructions, or rather warnings, by Jeremiah in the book of Jeremiah chapter 44 verses 26 through 27. It says, "Therefore hear ye the word of the Lord, all Judah that dwell in the land of Egypt. Behold, I have sworn by my great name, saith the Lord, that my name shall no more be named in the mouth of any man of Judah in all the land of Egypt, saying, the Lord God liveth. Behold, I will watch over them for evil, and not for good. And all men of Judah that are in the land of Egypt shall be consumed by the sword and by the famine, until there be an end of them." Continuing back to the reading, it says that the rebels even applied to the queen of heaven, Ishtar, by burning incense to call upon her favors in struggle against Babylon. The compatriots of Jeremiah were carried away into Egypt. He joined them under protest. The prophet warned them that he was going to push the king Nebuchadnezzar into Egypt and capture both Egypt and them. This warning could have caused many Israelites to migrate even deeper into Africa. According to Grizel, some Jewish mercenaries were employed by the Babylonians to guard the southern Egyptian border around 600 BC. They needed soldiers to protect the southern frontier of Egypt against the attacks of the Ethiopians. He added that they gave them the land in the district called Aswan and granted them permission to build a temple and offer sacrifices to their God. So we can see that even the southern kingdom made their way into Egypt, and with warnings from Jeremiah the prophet about things to come, these Judeans possibly would have migrated even deeper into Africa during that time and even after. Moving on to the book Between East and West, a history of the Jews of North Africa. It gives us some insight on Judeans migrating to Africa after the Babylonian exile. It reads, "It would be futile to try to fix a precise date for the establishment of the first Jewish settlements in North Africa, but it is generally accepted that the first communities of any importance date from about the time of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BCE. The second exile to Babylon was accompanied by a westward migration. Certain communities, among them Diaspora, maintain an oral tradition that they were founded at that time. There is also other migrations of Israelites that we can deal with into Africa, especially from the Roman period. Continuing reading from this book, it says, the 12 boatloads of Jewish captives that Titus had deported from Palestine to North Africa about the year 71 CE reinforced the existing Jewish colonies. According to St. Jerome, Jewish communities formed an unbroken chain from India to the limits of Africa, and scholarly research has made it possible to fix the precise sites of those in North Africa. So let's deal with the uprisings. The relentless conflict between the Jews of Palestine and its Roman invaders, which lasted more than a century, had profound repercussions in the two great African provinces, enriching their Jewish communities with the thousands who were forced to leave Palestine or who immigrated voluntarily. It has been estimated that 30,000 Jews were deported to Carthage by Titus, and Josephus recorded the presence of 500,000 Jews in Caesarea in the first century of the Christian era. North Africa was at this time the center of an extensive conversion to Judaism. The Palestinians who found refuge in North Africa brought with them a smothering hate of the Roman oppressors, which erupted into a revolt every opportunity. And it may be assumed that many voyages through North Africa of leading Jewish personalities, especially those of Rabbi Akbar, archfoe of Roman paganism, were not unconnected with these events. According to Josephus, a group of zealots under the leadership of a certain Jonathan fomented a powerful insurrection against the Romans in Caesarea. Shortly after the fall of Jerusalem, the indigenous African Jews frustrated this revolt. Following the denunciation of the insurgents by the distinguished Jews of the city, Jonathan was seized and executed along with most of his adherents. It continues, the Jews, animated by a national and religious ardor that was almost apocalyptic in its fever, rose up against the Greeks of Caesarea and for 3 years withstood all attempts at repression, such as cannot be assumed to have been prompted only by the religious fever of the Caesarea community, even though its members were the most fanatic of all. The Jews must have been very numerous, militarily well organized, and in all probability supported by the Berbers. In any event, Caesarea was one of the last corners of the Roman world where there was a fighting Jewish army. It was the sword of the Jews that put an end to Greek Caesarea at the beginning of the 2nd century CE. It continues on saying that the initial military success of the Jews indicate an effective organization and an intense penetration of the Jews among the Berber masses. But the revolt, like the last insurrection of the Jews in Palestine against the Roman world, was foredoomed. Trojan, preoccupied by the war in the east against the Parthians, appointed Marcius Turbo to quell the uprising in North Africa, and there do not seem to have been any military repercussions in Tunisia or the Caesarine province. The brutal repercussions of 118 CE marked the end of the development of Judaism in Caesarinica. The survivors fled westward into Caesarine province and southward, crossing the Sahara from oasis to oasis, eventually perhaps reaching as far as the Niger River. So because of the Jewish-Roman wars in Palestine and North Africa, you actually had Jews who fled Roman occupation as far as they could, passing the Sahara and perhaps reaching the Niger River. The book A History of the Jews complements the last source we just read really well. It says that Josephus, the Jewish historian, who lived 2 centuries later, described Caesarinica as the center of a large Jewish population. A further increase in the Jewish numbers came as a result of the defeat of the Jews by Rome in 70 CE. So large was the Jewish population of Caesarinica in the next generation that in the ill-fated uprisings of 115 through 117, the Jews almost overcame their pagan neighbors and the Roman armies. Rome's fearful vengeance caused many to flee farther west into the territory then known as Mauritania and now as Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. Other Jews from the former population of Cyrenaica fled completely beyond the reach of Rome into the desert to the south. Such is the explanation how the Sahara Desert first acquired Jewish tribes toughened by a fighting tradition and possessed a physical characteristic which is, it is said, still make them approximate very closely the original Jewish population of Palestine. So again, these Jews from the Jewish-Roman wars were making their way into the Sahara Desert. And to get a little bit more information on these Jews going into the Sahara Desert, we will be going to an introduction to the history of West Africa. And it reads, according to Della Fosse, the first permanent settlement of peoples from North Africa in Negro land occurred after the Jewish risings against Roman rule in Caesarinica in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, which led to an exodus to the south and west. Some of these Jews, or more probably perhaps Judaized Berbers, who were pastoralists, crossed the Sahara and settled among the Soninke agriculturalists of the Niger Bend between the site of Timbuktu and Messina. And again, keep in mind, Eldad the Danite was said to have traveled with a Soninke Jew. So after reviewing everything we've went over, it wouldn't be insane to say that you have descendants of the tribes of Israel beyond the Sahara, specifically in West Africa. In fact, for the Portuguese, as for other Europeans, there was a powerful sense that there were Jewish polities representing the lost tribes of Israel in the African interior. In the 1830s, for instance, a religious journal noted Africa therefore presents the only remaining likely place, and the advocates for the existence of the 10 tribes very confidently maintain that they are enclosed in the interior of that unexplored country. And this is coming from Diaspora's perspectives on Jewish culture in the Mediterranean and beyond. But let's continue on to the modern part of an universal history from the earliest account of time. It says, there are some who call themselves original Jews of the prosperity of Abraham, who pretend to have formerly come in colonies and to have settled themselves in Egypt, Abyssinia, and along the Niger. And their last are more numerous and considerable than the two former. But those who came and are here still in the greatest number, are such as refuged themselves in these parts, either after the destruction of Jerusalem and the dispersion of the Jewish nation by Titus Vespasian, mentioned in a former chapter, or who fled from the persecutions under the Romans, Persians, Saracens, and since under the Christians, as out of Italy in 1342, Spain and Portugal in 1462, and out of the Low Countries in 1350, France in 1403, and even England in 1422. All these go differently habited as well as divided among themselves. So after reading this, it lets us know that Jews who claim to be the prosperity of Abraham settled in Egypt, Abyssinia, as well as along the Niger. But it says specifically that the last, meaning the Niger, is more numerous than the two former, meaning Egypt and Abyssinia. So the Jews along the Niger was more numerous than in Egypt and in Abyssinia. It also lets us know that these Jews would have been coming from various migrations, including some that we covered and including later migrations dealing with the Jews in Europe being expelled and some coming to West Africa along the Niger River. So I hope you all enjoyed reviewing the history of Israelite migrations into Africa after various events and captivities. Stay tuned for part 2 as we continue to connect these migrations to tribes within West Africa in support of their traditions and oral traditions. Shalom and Todah for tuning in.
He gon' send his hand, destruction gotta come, that's how he get us out this lane. The devil working hard, trying to get us out his plane. His sheep hear his voice, so he can't get us out his hand. We gon' trust the son of man, blow your wings, Father. Your kingdom coming, we just trying to make it in, Father. Rather we